Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the quiet, disciplined world of ancient China, specifically into the private studies and daily lives of the scholars who dedicated themselves to mastering classical texts and refining their character. When you picture an ancient Chinese scholar, you might immediately imagine a figure of serene wisdom, perhaps sitting cross-legged amidst stacks of fragile scrolls, meticulously grinding ink with a steady hand, or maybe contemplating the natural beauty of a garden while sipping tea. It feels like a life dedicated to learning, philosophy, poetry, and discipline, a world seemingly far removed from our own noisy, fast-paced, and often chaotic modern lives. It's a path that required immense dedication, years of rigorous memorization, and unwavering perseverance, particularly given the incredibly challenging imperial examination system they often aspired to conquer. Frankly, if you were suddenly transported back in time and expected to live the life of one of these scholars today, required to spend decades memorizing classical texts word for word just for a chance at a government job, you probably wouldn't survive a week without either needing a very strong cup of historical coffee or simply collapsing from mental exhaustion and the sheer volume of material you'd have to master. It was a life of intense intellectual effort, but tonight, we're not going to focus solely on the demanding nature of their studies, the high-stakes pressure of the imperial exams, or the drama of court politics they might have eventually become embroiled in. Instead, we're going to gently pull back the curtain on their everyday existence and look at the small, repetitive, sometimes quirky, and ultimately quite calming details of their daily routines. The predictable habits, the quiet rituals, and the consistent rhythms that structured their days and, it turns out, are perfect for lulling you to sleep. We're looking for the mundane within the scholarly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here and find these quiet explorations into history soothing. And if you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments where you're winding down from tonight and what time it is there in your part of the world. It's always cool to see where these sleepy histories travel and who is listening along as they prepare for rest. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, consistent background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, exploring the gentle repetitions of a scholar's day. Ancient Chinese scholars, often referred to as the literati, were, for many centuries, the cultural and intellectual backbone of society. They were the keepers of historical knowledge, the interpreters of philosophical and moral traditions, especially Confucianism, the poets and artists who shaped aesthetic sensibilities, and the pool from which officials for the vast imperial bureaucracy were selected. Their lives were, by necessity, centered around rigorous study, self-cultivation through learning and disciplined practice, and often the pursuit of an ideal state of moral and intellectual refinement. But even a life dedicated to such lofty principles, profound contemplation, and rigorous learning was, at its core, structured by the simple and fundamental rhythms of the day: the rising and setting of the sun, the need for meals and rest, and the consistent demands of their chosen path. It wasn't a life of constant, unpredictable excitement, dramatic duels usually, or spontaneous adventures. Far from it. For most, it was a life largely defined by routine, discipline, and quiet persistence. These routines weren't always glamorous or inherently dramatic to an outside observer. They were filled with small, repeated actions that, taken individually, might seem unremarkable or even tedious by our modern standards. The grinding of ink, the careful handling of a brush, the repetitive recitation of ancient texts, the quiet sipping of tea, the structured social interactions. But it's precisely these repetitive, often meticulous, and predictable aspects of their daily existence that we'll explore. We'll look for the specific details, the subtle rituals, the sometimes peculiar personal habits that made their routines quirky by our standards, yet were simply the accepted, comforting fabric of their reality. And in that very repetition, that focus on small, deliberate actions performed consistently, lies a quiet, powerful, and ultimately very soothing rhythm. It's the opposite of a jarring surprise or sudden change. It's a gentle, predictable flow that mirrors the kind of rhythm conducive to sleep. One mainstream historical fact that fundamentally underlies the importance and structure of the scholar's routine throughout many dynasties is the long-standing imperial examination system, Keiju. This rigorous and highly competitive system, which evolved over centuries and was used to select officials for government service based on their mastery of classical literature and ethical principles, required decades, quite literally decades, of dedicated study and memorization of a vast canon of classical texts, history, and philosophy. This high-stakes, incredibly difficult goal instilled a deep-seated need for discipline, perseverance, and an intensely structured daily routine in any scholar who seriously hoped to succeed. You simply could not cram for these exams the way a modern student might. You had to live a life of consistent, disciplined study, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. This imposed a routine that was anything but flexible or spontaneous. It was a rigid framework around which their lives were built. Consider the sheer number of hours spent just reading classical texts, reciting them aloud until they were committed to memory, practicing calligraphy strokes until your hand ached and your brush control was perfect, or carefully preparing your ink and paper before a writing session. These weren't activities to be rushed or done haphazardly. They required immense patience, unwavering focus, and relentless repetition. And it's in that very repetition, that predictable sequence of small, deliberate, and often manual actions performed consistently over long periods, that we find the quiet, soothing rhythm of their days. It's the opposite of a jarring surprise. It's a gentle, but predictable flow that encourages the mind to settle. A quirky tidbit that hints at the individuality and personal investment within these seemingly rigid routines is the existence of numerous detailed personal accounts, diaries, and letters left by some scholars from various periods. These weren't solely formal records of political events or profound philosophical insights. They often included surprisingly mundane details about their daily habits: what time they woke up, what they ate, when they took breaks, who they visited, and even specific, sometimes peculiar, methods they used for studying, writing, or focusing their minds. These personal glimpses, preserved through history, reveal that while the goal of study and the demands of the system were shared, the way they structured their specific hours and performed their daily tasks could have unique, sometimes idiosyncratic, variations and rituals that made the routine personally meaningful or simply comfortable for them. It's like reading someone's historical to-do list, complete with little notes about ensuring the study was aired out at a specific time, or that their favorite inkstone was polished just so before use. Historians still argue whether the intense emphasis on strict routine, disciplined practice, and rote memorization inherent in the traditional Chinese examination system and scholarly life ultimately stifled creativity, critical thinking, and independent intellectual innovation, or if that demanding process provided a necessary, deep foundation of knowledge, discipline, and cultural literacy upon which true intellectual innovation and personal expression could later be built. Did the rhythm of recitation and the repetition of calligraphy stifle original thought, or did they provide the essential bedrock for it? This debate touches on profound questions about the pedagogical philosophy and its long-term effects on intellectual development. But for our purposes tonight, it simply highlights that their daily routines were not merely personal habits or practical necessities. They were deeply intertwined with the educational system, the political aspirations, and the cultural values of their time, adding a layer of societal weight and philosophical meaning to their everyday actions. So, as you settle into your own space, dim the lights and feel the gentle hum of the fan. Let go of any expectations of grand narratives or thrilling tales of ancient China. Instead, picture the quiet intensity of a scholar's study in the pre-dawn light, the subtle rustle of silk robes, the faint, clean scent of ink, the smooth, cool feel of a well-used inkstone. We are entering a world of quiet discipline, repetitive tasks, and subtle personal rituals, and focusing on those small, predictable actions, the careful preparation of tools, the precise repeated movements of the hand in writing, the hours of quiet, rhythmic concentration, is the perfect way to let your own mind find a state of calm and begin its journey towards rest. No need for grand historical events or dramatic figures tonight. just the gentle, predictable rhythm of historical routine. Our journey into the quiet, meticulously structured world of the ancient Chinese scholars' day begins, as most days for most people do, with the act of waking up. But for these dedicated individuals, particularly those seriously pursuing the path of scholarship and aspiring to success in the rigorous imperial examinations or government service, the day typically began not with a leisurely stretch long after the sun had risen, but well before dawn, while the world outside was still steeped in darkness and quietude. The concept of rising early, often very early, to begin their studies was deeply ingrained in the scholarly ethos and cultural values, seen not merely as a practical way to get more hours of study in, but also as a significant sign of diligence, dedication to learning, and a form of crucial self-mastery and discipline. Imagine the scene as you, an ancient Chinese scholar, stir from sleep in your modest home or academy lodgings. It is still dark outside, the kind of deep darkness that exists before the first hint of twilight appears on the horizon. The only light within your room, if any, likely comes from a small, flickering oil lamp that you might have left burning low overnight, or that you light immediately upon waking. The air is cool, perhaps even cold, especially in the autumn and winter months, and possibly damp depending on the season and your location. You're not waking up to the jarring, insistent sound of a modern alarm clock, but perhaps to the distant, natural call of a rooster beginning its day prematurely, or the soft, familiar sounds of the household beginning to stir, the quiet padding of feet, the distant clinking of a pot in the kitchen, the muffled voices of servants or family members starting their own early tasks, getting out of a warm bed, whether it's a simple mat on the floor or a more substantial wooden bed frame, into the cool, dark room required a conscious act of will and discipline. There was no hitting a snooze button in ancient China to snatch a few more minutes of sleep. The commitment to your demanding studies, the pressure of the upcoming exams, the deep-seated value placed on learning. These were the internal forces that pulled you out of your rest before your body might have fully preferred to wake. This early start wasn't just about the practical necessity of putting in more hours studying the vast classical texts. It was also seen as a crucial form of self-cultivation, a victory of your intellectual and moral discipline over your physical desires and comforts like the simple desire to sleep in until you felt fully rested. It adds a distinct layer of quiet, internal effort, and deliberate choice to the very beginning of the day. A mainstream historical fact that profoundly supports and illustrates the cultural importance of this practice is the prevalence of proverbs, aphorisms, and educational texts from various dynasties that consistently emphasize the value and necessity of early rising for study and for achieving success in both academic and official life. Phrases like, "An inch of time is an inch of gold, but an inch of gold cannot buy an inch of time," underscored the preciousness of every moment, particularly the quiet, uninterrupted hours of early morning, which were considered most conducive to focused intellectual work before the distractions of the day began. Another common saying translated roughly to study diligently, rise before the rooster. This wasn't just a piece of casual advice, it was a deeply ingrained cultural ideal and a widely recognized mark of a truly dedicated scholar. Think about the distinct feeling of quiet solitude in those pre-dawn hours. The world outside is still largely asleep, shrouded in darkness. The noise and bustle of daily life in the household or the nearby town have not yet begun in earnest. The only significant sounds are likely your own quiet movements, dressing, lighting a lamp, preparing your ink, perhaps the distant, muted sounds of nature or the very first stirrings of human activity. This was considered a prime time for focused concentration, for reading texts aloud in that rhythmic chanting style we'll discuss later without disturbing others, or for practicing calligraphy or writing when the mind was fresh and uncluttered by the day's events. It set a tone of deliberate, quiet effort, discipline, and focused intention for the rest of the day. A slow, gentle, yet resolute transition from the world of dreams and rest to the demanding world of intellectual pursuit. A quirky tidbit that, while perhaps exaggerated in some retellings, highlights the intense dedication and the physical lengths some scholars would reputedly go to in order to maintain their focus and stay awake during these difficult early hours is the existence of anecdotes describing rather extreme measures. Some stories tell of scholars who would tie their cue a long braid of hair worn in certain dynasties to a beam above their desk, so that if they started to nod off, the tug on their hair would wake them up. Others mention scholars keeping a sharp awl or stylus handy to prick their own leg if they felt themselves drifting to sleep during early morning study sessions. While these might be extreme examples meant to emphasize legendary diligence, they illustrate the cultural value placed on overcoming physical tiredness for the sake of study and the inclusion of small, deliberate, even uncomfortable physical acts within the routine to ensure mental alertness. Imagine the mild discomfort, the small, sharp sensation, keeping you just alert enough to keep reading the classics. A rather pointed reminder to pay attention, wouldn't you say? Historians still argue about the extent to which the ideal of rising significantly before dawn was truly practiced universally by the majority of scholars across all social strata, economic levels, and historical periods, or if it was more of a Confucian ideal upheld primarily by the most dedicated, ambitious, or affluent few who had the luxury of controlling their own schedules and access to resources like lamp oil for study in the dark. Was it a widespread reality for every student and scholar, or more of a cultural goal that most aspired to, but didn't always achieve perfectly due to practical constraints of daily life? Work, or family responsibilities. This debate acknowledges that human nature being what it is, and life's practicalities being what they are, not everyone might have enthusiastically or consistently embraced the cold, dark mornings with perfect discipline. But the ideal and the cultural value placed on early rising for intellectual pursuits was undeniably a significant and pervasive part of the scholarly ethos documented in texts. So, as you picture the ancient scholar stirring in the deep dark before dawn, facing the discipline of an early start, the cool air, and the quiet solitude, move past any dramatic notions of superhuman effort. See the quiet, persistent act of simply getting out of bed when it's still cold and dark. The conscious choice to prioritize study over comfort. It's a familiar struggle, isn't it? That quiet battle against the desire to stay warm and asleep. That quiet commitment to routine. That slow, deliberate transition from sleep to wakefulness in the stillness and darkness of the morning. It's a gentle, shared human experience across centuries and cultures. The quiet victory of discipline, perfectly suited for easing your own mind towards rest. Just the subtle shift from slumber to quiet alertness. The feeling of the cool air on your skin. Sleepily. You're up now, having conquered the initial urge to stay in your warm bed in the pre-dawn cool, having performed that first quiet act of discipline. As the ancient Chinese scholar, the next predictable step in your morning routine, before diving headfirst into the demanding world of classical texts and meticulous ink strokes, often involved specific personal grooming and cleansing practices. While modern ideas of hygiene, sanitation systems, and readily available hot water from a tap differ greatly from those of ancient China, these scholars had their own established, sometimes specific or even ritualistic practices for refreshing themselves and preparing their body and mind for the day's rigorous mental work. These weren't always elaborate, but they were deliberate, adding another layer of structured, repetitive action to the quiet start of their day. Imagine the process within the context of the time. Access to clean, warm water wasn't as simple as turning a tap. Water might need to be fetched from a household well or a nearby stream, perhaps by servants or family members, and then heated over a fire if warm water was desired and affordable or available. Washing typically involved using a basin or a series of basins and a cloth. The focus of these morning ablutions was often on cleansing the parts of the body directly involved in their scholarly work and social interactions: the face, the hands, and sometimes rinsing the mouth. It was a practical necessity. Yes, clean hands were important for handling delicate paper and silk scrolls, and a clean face was part of presenting oneself properly, but it was often also imbued with a symbolic purpose, seen as an act of physical purification before engaging with the pure, ideally an elevated world of classical learning, philosophy, and ethical principles. Consider the sensory details of these practices. The feel of the water on your skin, perhaps cool and bracing if unheated, or pleasantly warm if you had access to heated water. The texture of the cloth used for washing, likely rougher than modern terry cloth. The subtle but perhaps slightly alkaline or earthy scent of a simple form of soap, if used, often made from plant ashes or animal fats. Not the heavily fragranced bars we use today. The sound of splashing water in the quiet room, the gentle rubbing of skin with the cloth. These were small, quiet, intimate actions performed in the solitude of the early morning study or a designated wash area. The repetitive motions of washing the face, rubbing the hands together, rinsing. These were simple, physical rhythms that helped transition the body and mind from the state of sleep to a state of readiness and alert cleanliness for the tasks ahead. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is that while standards and practices of personal hygiene varied greatly across different social classes and time periods in ancient China, cleanliness, particularly of the hands and face, was generally valued, especially among the educated elite and those preparing for important activities like study, writing, receiving guests, or participating in ceremonies and official duties. While full-body bathing might not have been a daily occurrence for most people due to the logistics of heating water and lack of plumbing, these focused morning ablutions were a common and recommended practice for those engaged in scholarly or official pursuits, seen as essential for both physical comfort and social presentation. Think about the feeling of physical refreshment these simple acts provided. The cool water waking up the skin, the act of washing away the last vestiges of sleep, the feeling of clean hands ready to handle precious scrolls and ink brushes. It was a moment of quiet physical preparation, a set of repetitive physical actions that served as a transition and a signal that the intellectual work was about to begin. It's the historical equivalent of that first splash of water on your face in the morning today, or the routine of washing your hands before you start an important task, but perhaps a bit more deliberate and manual in its execution. A quirky tidbit that hints at the inclusion of specific, sometimes unusual by our standards, details in their morning grooming routine is the mention in some ancient Chinese medical texts, historical accounts, and anecdotal writings of practices related to oral hygiene. While not involving modern toothbrushes and toothpaste, these accounts suggest that some people, including scholars, would use tooth-cleaning twigs from certain types of trees to rub their teeth and gums, or even rub salt on their teeth and gums in the morning to cleanse them. While these practices might not have been universal, their mention shows an awareness of oral hygiene and the inclusion of these small, specific actions in the morning routine for some. Imagine the slightly rough texture of the twig, or the bracing, salty taste in your mouth first thing in the morning, another small sensory detail anchoring the routine in the physical present before the abstract work of study begins. A rather natural toothpaste, wouldn't you say? Historians still argue about the frequency and thoroughness of bathing and personal hygiene practices across different social classes and various time periods in ancient China. While scholarly and medical texts describe certain ideals of cleanliness and recommend specific practices, the reality for those with fewer resources, living in different climates, or facing challenging daily lives might have been different. Was daily washing of face and hands a truly universal practice among scholars of all economic levels throughout history, or did it vary significantly based on wealth, access to sufficient clean water, and individual preference? This debate highlights the potential gap between the prescribed routine and the lived experience. Acknowledging that practical limitations existed, but the ideal of morning cleansing and preparing oneself physically for the day, especially for scholarly work, was clearly present and documented in the scholarly literature and cultural norms. So, as you picture the ancient scholar performing these simple, repetitive cleansing and grooming rituals in the quiet of the pre-dawn or early morning, move past any modern notions of a hot shower or a luxurious bathroom experience. See the basic tools, the basin, the cloth, the simple soap or salt, the cool or lukewarm water, the focused, deliberate movements of washing and cleansing. It's a moment of quiet, physical preparation, a set of physical routines performed consistently, setting the stage for the intense mental work ahead, that steady, deliberate process of washing, rinsing, and preparing the physical self. It's a calming physical rhythm, predictable and grounded, perfectly suited for helping your own mind settle down and disengage from the day's potential stresses. Just the soft sound of splashing water, washing away the last vestiges of sleepiness and preparing for the day, sleepily. You've risen before dawn, completed your quiet morning cleansing rituals, feeling refreshed and prepared physically for the day ahead. As the ancient Chinese scholar, your attention would then turn to the physical space where the vast majority of your waking hours dedicated to intellectual pursuits would be spent your study. This wasn't just about tidying up stray scrolls or dusting off your desk. It was often a deliberate, almost ritualistic act of setting the stage, of preparing the environment both physically and mentally for focused intellectual work. The study was considered a crucial sanctuary, a personal space where the scholar engaged with the wisdom of the ancients and cultivated their own mind and character. And its order, atmosphere, and the meticulous preparation of its tools were considered vital for cultivating the right state of mind for deep learning and creative expression. Imagine the typical scholarly study, often a simple room, perhaps attached to the scholar's home or located within an academy. Furnishings would likely be sparse and functional, emphasizing practicality and conducive to quiet concentration rather than excessive comfort or luxury. The key elements would be a sturdy desk or a low table suitable for writing and reading while seated on a mat or cushion on the floor. There would be shelves or cabinets for storing precious scrolls and books. And fundamentally, the essential tools of their craft would be present: an inkstone, an inkstick, a collection of brushes of various sizes, paper or silk for writing, and possibly seals and vermilion paste. Preparing for the day's work involved arranging these items with care and precision, often following a personal routine. The inkstone, perhaps used the day before, might need to be cleaned of dried ink residue. The inkstick, a solid block of hardened soot and glue, would need to be prepared by grinding it with a small amount of water on the inkstone, a process that produced the liquid ink used for writing. The brushes, rinsed after their last use, would need to be selected and laid out, ready for action. Paper or silk scrolls would be unrolled and placed correctly on the desk. The act of preparing these tools and arranging the study space was itself a form of preliminary discipline, requiring focus, patience, and deliberate movement before the intense mental work of study or composition began. The rhythmic sound of grinding the inkstick on the inkstone, a soft, consistent scraping noise that was often described as a calming prelude to writing, the careful handling of the delicate brushes, the smooth unrolling of a scroll, the settling of oneself onto the mat or cushion. These were not rushed actions. They were part of a conscious transition into a state of scholarly concentration and readiness. The distinct earthy scent of the ink, a smell unique to the scholar's workspace, would begin to fill the air, a subtle sensory signal that the work was commencing. The feel of the cool, smooth inkstone under the hand, the texture of the paper, the balanced weight of the brush, all these tactile details were part of the familiar, comforting routine. A mainstream historical fact that profoundly highlights the importance and value placed on this meticulous preparation and the tools themselves is that the implements of writing and painting, collectively known as the four treasures of the study, the brush, the ink, the paper, and the inkstone, were not merely regarded as functional items but were highly valued, often beautifully crafted objects, treated with immense respect and care by scholars. Owning fine brushes, a well-aged inkstick, high-quality paper or silk, and a prized inkstone was a source of pride and could be a significant investment. The discipline involved not just in using these tools skillfully but in maintaining them properly, cleaning brushes meticulously. Caring for the inkstone was seen as an integral part of the scholarly discipline and a reflection of the scholar's own character and respect for their craft. Consider the atmosphere they cultivated within this space. The study was deliberately intended to be a place of quietude, order, and focused concentration, ideally free from the mundane distractions and noise of the wider household or the outside world. Natural light, coming through windows or open doorways, was important for reading and writing during the daylight hours. In the early morning before dawn, or in the evening after sunset, lamplight from oil lamps would create pools of warm, flickering light on the desk and surrounding areas, adding to the sense of intimate concentration. The air might carry the clean scent of ink and paper, perhaps mixed with the faint, specific smell of lamp oil and sometimes the calming aroma of incense, as some scholars burned incense to purify the air, mark the time, or aid concentration and create a serene atmosphere. A quirky tidbit is that some scholars were known to arrange their books and scrolls in very specific, sometimes quite idiosyncratic or even peculiar, ways that went far beyond simple neatness or alphabetical order. Rather than just practical organization, they might arrange their collection by the color of the scroll ties, the height of the scrolls, the date they were acquired, or perhaps based on a deeply personal, unique system reflecting the thematic connections between texts known only to the scholar themselves. Creating a visually unique, personal library layout that might look like chaos to an outsider but was perfectly ordered in the scholar's mind. Imagine trying to find a specific text on such a shelf. This highlights the infusion of personal habits and quirks even into the seemingly simple task of organizing one's workspace. Historians still argue whether the ideal of a serene, minimalist, and perfectly ordered study, so often depicted in classical Chinese paintings and described in texts, was a widespread reality for the majority of scholars across different economic levels and time periods, or if it was more of an aesthetic ideal portrayed in art and literature, with many scholars actually working in more crowded, less dedicated spaces, perhaps shared with family activities, or simply having studies that were less meticulously organized due to the practicalities of daily life. Was the perfectly prepared and ordered study a common, attainable experience for most, or primarily an aspirational image reflecting scholarly values and aesthetic preferences? This debate points to the potential gap between the prescribed ideal and the lived experience. But the intention and the cultural value placed on creating a conducive intellectual environment through careful, deliberate preparation of the space and tools was clearly a significant part of the scholarly ethos. So, as you picture the ancient scholar meticulously preparing their study for the day, cleaning the inkstone, grinding the ink with that quiet scraping sound, selecting and laying out brushes, unrolling a scroll with care, arranging the few key items on the desk, move past any notions of a cluttered desk or a rushed setup before diving into work. See the deliberate ritual, the focused movements, the attention to the tools, the conscious creation of a personal sanctuary for deep learning and creativity. It's a quiet, deliberate act of preparation, a physical routine performed consistently each morning, setting the stage both physically and mentally for the demanding intellectual work ahead. That steady, repetitive process of arranging and preparing, the sounds of grinding ink and rustling paper, the sense of ink and old paper. It's a calming, physical, and sensory rhythm, predictable and grounding, perfectly suited for helping your own mind settle down and disengage from the day's potential stresses. Just the soft sound of grinding ink, creating the medium for thought, sleepily, with the study environment meticulously prepared, the ink ground and ready, and the essential tools laid out with care. The ancient Chinese scholars' day would truly commence with the fundamental core activity of their lives, engaging with the vast and complex body of classical texts. But this wasn't just casual reading in the way we might silently read a book or an article today. Instead, it involved very specific techniques of recitation and memorization that were deeply ingrained in the traditional educational system. Practices that were inherently repetitive, often rhythmic, and absolutely fundamental to mastering the immense volume of classical literature required for success in the imperial exams and for participation in scholarly life. Imagine the scholar seated comfortably at their desk, perhaps on a cushion or mat, with a scroll unrolled before them or a stack of bamboo slips or bound pages at hand. They wouldn't typically read silently to themselves, absorbing the words solely through their eyes. Instead, a primary method of study was reading aloud, a practice known as dushu, a term that literally means to read books, but carried the strong implication. For centuries of reading those books aloud, the scholar would read the classical texts out loud, often in a chanting or rhythmic tone, their voice filling the quiet study. This practice was not merely about vocalizing the words, it was a crucial technique believed to deeply aid memorization and comprehension, engaging not just the visual sense but also the auditory and even physical senses in the learning process. The key elements of dushu were rhythm and repetition. Scholars would read passages, sometimes just a few lines, sometimes entire chapters, over and over again. They might repeat a difficult section dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of times. Particularly key philosophical aphorisms, historical passages, or poetic lines that needed to be memorized verbatim for the examinations. The goal was to have the words etched not just onto the page, but into the very fabric of their memory, accessible for recall at any moment. This was a process that involved a significant amount of rote learning. Yes, but it was also one that, through its very repetition and often chanting-like delivery, created a kind of internal rhythm, a steady, predictable flow of language, sound, and ideas that could become almost hypnotic with its consistency. The sound of their own voice, repeating the ancient words in a familiar cadence, might rise and fall, following the natural rhythm of the classical text, a constant, predictable auditory anchor to their study time. A mainstream historical fact that profoundly highlights the absolute centrality and importance of this practice of reading text aloud and memorization is the structure and requirements of the imperial examination system. As we discussed earlier, this system, the primary path to government service for centuries, required scholars to demonstrate an extensive and incredibly detailed knowledge of classical literature. In the examination halls, scholars were required to quote extensively and accurately, often verbatim, from memory from a vast canon of foundational texts like the Confucian Four Books and Five Classics, historical chronicles, and classical poetry. There was no access to reference materials during the examination sessions, which could last for days. Therefore, the ability to recall vast amounts of complex text accurately from memory, a skill honed through countless hours of repetitive, rhythmic reading aloud, was not just one study technique among many. It was an absolutely necessary, non-negotiable skill for social and political advancement. Consider the physical act involved in this practice. Beyond just the vocalization, there were subtle physical engagements as well. The subtle movements of the lips, tongue, and vocal cords to form the ancient sounds, the regulation of breath required for sustained recitation, and the slight swaying of the body back and forth that some scholars habitually adopted while reading aloud. Perhaps finding the gentle motion aided their rhythm and concentration. It engaged the body as well as the mind in the process of learning, turning the act of study into a physical, rhythmic, and deeply embodied activity. It's the historical equivalent of listening to an audiobook on repeat to really absorb the material, but in this case, you're the one performing the reading aloud, creating the auditory input through your own physical effort for hours on end. A quirky tidbit that adds a touch of personal variation to this widespread practice is that some scholars were known to vary the speed, volume, and intensity of their recitation, depending on the text, their mood, or the specific phase of memorization they were in. Some might read very quickly in a low murmur for texts they were already familiar with, almost running through them as a form of review. Others might chant very loudly and slowly, perhaps pacing back and forth in their study or even in a garden, for difficult sections or for emphasis, as if trying to physically project the words into their memory or into the air itself. They might read different types of text with different cadences, a historical text with a steady, narrative pace, a philosophical text with a more contemplative, segmented rhythm, and poetry with a flowing, melodic chant. These variations added a layer of personal rhythm and ritual to the core practice of dushu. Historians still argue whether the intense focus on memorization and the practice of rhythmic recitation in the traditional Chinese educational system ultimately hindered the development of critical thinking, analytical skills, and independent interpretation of the classics by prioritizing rote recall over original thought, or if the sheer depth of knowledge, familiarity with language, and disciplined focus gained through this repetitive process eventually provided a necessary, profound foundation of cultural literacy and mental discipline, upon which truly deep insights, critical analysis, and creative applications of those classical principles could later be built. Did the repetitive rhythm of recitation and the demands of verbatim recall stifle original thought? Or did they provide the essential bedrock and vocabulary for it? This debate touches on profound questions about the effectiveness and limitations of this particular pedagogical philosophy. But the daily reality for countless scholars involved hours upon hours of rhythmic, repetitive reading aloud, filling their personal space with the sound of ancient words. So, as you picture the ancient scholars seated or perhaps pacing in their study, engaged in this core practice of dushu, move past the idea of simple, silent learning. See the active, vocal, rhythmic engagement with the text? Hear the steady sound of the recitation, perhaps rising and falling in a gentle chant. Imagine the subtle physical movements, the sway of the body, the regulation of breath. Feel the sheer repetition of the words being spoken and heard internally. It's a process that required discipline, focus, and vocal endurance. Yes, but in its very repetitiveness and rhythm, it created a calming, almost hypnotic soundscape. That steady, repetitive rhythm of reading aloud, the sound of their own voice filling the quiet space. It's a very calming, almost hypnotic auditory experience, both for the scholar and for us contemplating it, perfect for helping your own mind slow down its internal chatter and drift. Just the gentle drone of ancient words. Repeating, repeating, sleepily. From the rhythmic chanting of classical texts, filling the quiet study with the steady sound of ancient words being recited aloud, the ancient Chinese scholar would often transition to another fundamental, core, and profoundly repetitive practice: calligraphy. The art of beautiful writing was far more than just a functional skill needed for putting words onto paper or silk. It was a central discipline, a revered art form, a path of self-cultivation, and an absolutely necessary tool for both academic work and aspiring to, or serving in, official duties. Hours upon hours each day, week after week, year after year, were spent practicing individual strokes, forming complex characters, and meticulously copying classical texts or model examples of famous calligraphers, creating a daily routine filled with focused, deliberate, meticulous, and wonderfully repetitive physical movements of the hand and arm. Imagine the scholar seated comfortably at their desk, perhaps having just finished a session of reading aloud, feeling the rhythm of the words still resonating. The inkstone is prepared, its surface smooth and holding the freshly ground, rich, dark ink. The brush, selected from a collection of different sizes and types, is dipped carefully into the ink, just enough to hold a sufficient amount without dripping. The paper or silk lies spread out smoothly before them, waiting. The process of writing begins the careful positioning of the body, the precise holding of the brush vertically in the hand with a relaxed but firm grip, the specific angle at which the brush is applied to the paper, the controlled pressure exerted to create strokes of varying thickness and modulation, and the slow, deliberate movement across the surface to form a single stroke, then another, and another, building the character stroke by meticulous stroke. Each character, whether simple or complex, is composed of a specific sequence of strokes, each requiring the same level of focused attention, control, and precision. The repetition in calligraphy practice came primarily from practicing the same fundamental strokes over and over again: the horizontal stroke, the vertical stroke, the sweeping stroke, the hook, the dot, aiming for perfection of form, consistency, and fluidity. It also came from repeatedly writing the same characters, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of times, or copying out long passages from classical texts or examples of famous calligraphers. This copying was a common and essential practice, not just for studying the content of the text or memorizing it further, but as a primary method for refining and perfecting one's own calligraphic hand. Line after line, character after character. The scholar would reproduce the ancient words or the master's forms, focusing intently on the aesthetics, the balance, the structure, and the flow of the writing, striving to capture not just the physical shape but also the inner spirit key of the character. This required immense patience, unwavering concentration, and disciplined physical control, hour after hour. A mainstream historical fact that profoundly highlights the importance and cultural significance of calligraphy in ancient Chinese society, particularly among the educated elite, is its status as one of the four arts considered essential accomplishments for a cultivated gentleman junzi, alongside painting, music playing the guqian, and the strategy board game goeki. Proficiency in calligraphy was not merely seen as a useful skill, it was a highly valued mark of education, discipline, moral character, and refined taste, believed to be a window into the calligrapher's soul. In the imperial bureaucracy, neat, precise, legible, And aesthetically pleasing writing was absolutely essential for preparing official documents, memorials to the throne, government records, and even personal communications, further emphasizing its practical importance beyond artistic expression and self-cultivation. Consider the deep sensory experience involved in dedicated calligraphy practice. The smooth glide of the brush across the absorbent paper or silk, the subtle drag and slight scratching sound as the brush fibers interact with the surface, the distinct earthy and often comforting scent of the ink itself filling the air around the desk, the visual satisfaction or occasional frustration of seeing the character take shape stroke by stroke under your hand, the feeling of the weight and balance of the brush in your grip, the texture of the paper. It was a practice that engaged multiple senses simultaneously, creating a rich, immersive experience. The quiet focus required, shutting out external distractions and centering one's entire attention completely on the small, deliberate movements of the hand, wrist, and arm, and the interaction between brush, ink, and surface. A quirky tidbit that adds a touch of personal variation and sometimes eccentricity to this widespread practice is that some famous calligraphers were known to have very specific, sometimes quite peculiar, routines or habits related to their practice that they believed were essential for their focus or creativity. Some preferred working only at certain times of day or night, perhaps under particular lighting conditions like moonlight. Others used particular types of brushes made from the hair of specific animals, or insisted on using ink sourced from famous specific regions known for their ink production, believing it had unique qualities. Some developed unique postures for sitting or standing while writing, or unusual methods of holding the brush that deviated from the standard prescribed grip, but which they swore enhanced their control or spontaneity. One somewhat legendary and likely exaggerated story tells of a calligrapher who, seeking to enhance his artistic freedom and spontaneity, dipped his brush in wine instead of water when grinding ink, claiming it loosened his brushwork, though perhaps made his writing less permanent over time. Historians still argue about the relationship between rigorous calligraphy practice and deeper philosophical or spiritual cultivation. Was the discipline of calligraphy primarily seen as a path to self-improvement, cultivating essential virtues like patience, focus, perseverance, and understanding broader principles of harmony, balance, rhythm, and natural flow as embodied in the strokes? Or was it primarily a demanding practical skill honed through repetitive practice solely for social and professional advancement, with the deeper philosophical and artistic interpretations being secondary or only applied by the most elite calligraphers? This debate touches on the deeper meaning and purpose attributed to the practice within scholarly life. But the daily reality for virtually every scholar involved hours of focused, repetitive physical motion, creating familiar shapes on paper, refining their hand stroke by meticulous stroke. So, as you picture the ancient scholar engrossed in their calligraphy practice, seated quietly at their desk, brush in hand, move past the idea of just writing words. See the deliberate ritual, the focused movements of the hand and arm, the immense patience, the relentless repetition of strokes and characters, the striving for perfection in form and spirit. It's a practice that demanded discipline and control. Yes, but in its very repetitiveness and the quiet focus it required, it created a calming, almost meditative rhythm. That steady, deliberate movement of the brush across the paper, following the invisible lines, creating familiar shapes, both simple and complex. It's a very visual, very physical, and ultimately very calming process to contemplate. Perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift. Just the soft scratch of the brush on paper, the subtle scent of ink, repeating stroke after stroke. Sleepily. You've spent the early morning hours engaged in the quiet, rhythmic intensity of reading aloud and the meticulous, focused discipline of calligraphy practice, filling your study with the sounds of recitation and the subtle scents of ink and paper. These are demanding intellectual and physical tasks, requiring significant energy and concentration. And amidst these hours of rigorous study, the ancient Chinese scholars' day would predictably and necessarily include scheduled meal times. These weren't typically elaborate banquets filled with a wide array of rich dishes unless they were fortunate enough to be guests at a special occasion, which would be a notable break from the routine. Instead, the daily meals were generally simple, often quite Spartan, and dictated by the rhythms of the household or academy and the demands of their demanding study schedule. The predictability and the simplicity of their meals add another quiet layer to the calm, routine structure of their lives. Imagine the meal laid out before you, perhaps on a small personal table in your study or in a communal dining area if you were at an academy. Likely, the central component would be a bowl of cooked grain. This would be rice if you were in the southern parts of China or came from a wealthy family who could afford to acquire it consistently, or more commonly, millet, barley, or other grains in the north. Alongside the grain, you might find some simply prepared pickled or cooked vegetables, perhaps a thin broth made from vegetables or bones, and less frequently, depending heavily on the scholar's wealth, social status, location, and the availability of resources. A small portion of fermented beans like dufu or tofu in later periods, salted fish or meat. The primary focus of these daily meals was on providing necessary sustenance, calories, and energy for the body to support the demanding work of the mind, rather than on culinary extravagance. Novelty, or exciting, complex flavors every day? Meals were likely eaten efficiently, providing the necessary replenishment before returning to the scrolls and inkstone. The act of eating itself was probably often a quiet affair, particularly if the scholar ate alone in their study. If they ate with family members or fellow students at an academy, there might be some conversation, but often the focus would still be on consuming the meal efficiently, allowing for a necessary pause before resuming intellectual work. The flavors of the food would typically be simple and grounded in the natural tastes of the grains and vegetables, perhaps enhanced by salt, crucial for preservation and flavor, fermentation adding tangy or savory notes, and simple seasonings like ginger or onions. Spicy or heavily seasoned food, particularly with the fiery chili peppers common in some regional Chinese cuisines today, was not a daily norm for most of ancient history, as chilies were introduced from the Americas much later. A mainstream historical fact is that the basic staple diet for the majority of people in ancient China, including scholars without high official positions or significant landholdings, was overwhelmingly grain-based. Cereals such as millet, barley, and wheat were primary in the north, while rice became increasingly dominant in the south over time. Meat was generally a luxury and less commonly consumed as a daily staple compared to vegetables, grains, and sometimes legumes or fish, reflecting the agricultural practices, economic realities, and population density throughout much of Chinese history. This means that a scholar's daily meals, while potentially varying slightly by region and wealth, were likely quite consistent and simple in their basic components across days, weeks, and months, providing a predictable form of nourishment. Consider the routine of the meals within the daily structure perhaps 2 or 3 times a day, at predictable hours dictated by the daylight and the established study schedule. A simple morning meal, perhaps porridge, a more substantial midday meal, and a lighter evening meal. The preparation was likely simple, using familiar seasonal ingredients available locally or from their own garden. There wasn't the mental stimulation or decision-making involved in choosing from a vast menu of diverse options or experiencing new, exciting culinary delights every day. It was the same basic sustenance, provided at the same basic times, a predictable refueling stop in the day's activities. This predictability, this lack of culinary surprises or complex choices, reduces decision fatigue and adds to the overall sense of calm. Unchanging routine. A quirky tidbit is that some scholars, particularly those who followed Buddhist or Taoist philosophical or religious practices, or who lived a reclusive life in monasteries or remote areas, might have adhered to strict vegetarian diets as part of their cultivation and beliefs. This would add another specific dietary rule to their lives, further limiting the variety of their meals exclusively to plant-based fare, making the daily menu even more consistent, predictable, and perhaps less exciting to a modern palate used to diverse proteins. Imagine your meal routine being even more predictable. Grain, vegetables, broth, repeated, perhaps with a slightly different vegetable depending on the season. Historians still argue about the overall nutritional adequacy and potential health implications of the typical ancient Chinese diet, particularly for individuals engaged in demanding intellectual work and long hours of sedentary study without access to a wide variety of foods or supplements. Did the heavy reliance on grains and limited access to diverse protein sources Vitamins and minerals impact their health, energy levels, cognitive function, or lifespan in ways different from populations with different diets. This debate touches on the practical realities and potential long-term health outcomes of their diet. But within the daily routine, the simple but scheduled meals provided a necessary, predictable break from study and a consistent form of physical replenishment, without overstimulating the senses or demanding complex choices. So, as you picture the ancient scholar partaking in their simple, scheduled midday meal, perhaps a bowl of millet and some pickled greens, move past any modern notions of varied, exciting cuisine or leisurely, conversation-filled dining experiences. See the basic bowl of grain, the familiar vegetables, the quiet, efficient act of eating for sustenance. It's a necessary pause in the day, a predictable refueling, a moment of quiet consumption without the distraction or stimulation of novel flavors or elaborate dishes. That steady, simple act of eating, the quiet clinking of chopsticks or spoons against the bowl. The familiar taste? It's a very grounding, very calming part of the routine, predictable and sensory in its own quiet way, perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift. Just the gentle rhythm of sustenance being consumed. Repeating, repeating, sleepily. Following the simple, predictable routine of their midday meal, providing necessary physical sustenance. The ancient Chinese scholars' day would often continue with another fundamental element that was deeply integrated into their routine and cultural identity, the consumption of tea. Tea in ancient China was far more than just a simple beverage for hydration. It was a cultural institution, a focal point for social interaction, a source of gentle stimulation and focus, an aid to contemplation and meditation, and often a daily ritual performed with care and precision. The preparation and drinking of tea provided predictable, calming, and sensory pauses throughout their long hours of study, weaving a thread of quiet ritual and focused attention through the day. Imagine the process of preparing tea in a scholar's study. It was rarely as simple or quick as dipping a tea bag in hot water, a convenience that did not exist. Depending on the historical period, the process involved specific steps. In earlier periods, tea might be ground into a powder and whisked into hot water in a bowl, or compressed into cakes that were broken apart and boiled. In later periods, the preferred method evolved to steeping loose leaves in a pot. Regardless of the exact method, which varied over centuries, the preparation involved deliberate actions, heating water over a small stove in the study or nearby, selecting the appropriate amount of tea leaves or powder, placing them carefully in the pot or bowl, and then performing the specific actions required, steeping the leaves for the right amount of time, or whisking the powder with a bamboo whisk until frothy. The ritualistic nature of handling the tea leaves or powder, the sounds of the water heating, the warmth of the pot or bowl in the hands, the visual beauty of the leaves unfolding in the hot water or the powder dissolving, and the distinct, often subtle and earthy, aroma that filled the air as the tea brewed. These were all sensory details that elevated the act beyond simple drinking. It was a mindful process, requiring attention and creating a moment of focused engagement with the physical world before returning to the abstract world of texts and ideas. Tea provided a gentle stimulant caffeine, helping scholars stay alert and focused during long hours of sedentary study, particularly in the quiet afternoons or evenings, without the stronger, more jarring effects associated with substances like coffee, which, again, wasn't available in ancient China. It was widely believed to have numerous health benefits, clearing the mind, aiding digestion, promoting longevity, and even calming the spirit. Sipping hot tea slowly, often in small cups, savoring the nuanced flavor and feeling the warmth spread, was a moment of quiet contemplation, a brief, predictable escape from the intensity of intellectual work. It was a liquid punctuation mark, a small, calming ceremony, repeated multiple times a day. A mainstream historical fact is that tea cultivation and consumption originated in China, with a history stretching back thousands of years, and it became profoundly integrated into Chinese culture over centuries, evolving from a medicinal drink to a popular beverage and, eventually, into elaborate ceremonies and forming a significant part of scholarly monastic and later wider social life. The classic of Tea Cha Jing, written by Lu Yu in the 8th century, is a testament to how developed and ritualized tea preparation and appreciation had become. outlining detailed methods for cultivation, preparation, and consumption, highlighting its importance well beyond simple sustenance. Tea houses also became important centers of social and intellectual exchange. But the private act of preparing and drinking tea in one's study, alone or with a close friend, was equally significant as a calming and focusing part of the daily or weekly routine. Consider the different types of tea that emerged over time: green tea, black tea, oolong tea, pu'er tea, and the specific preparation methods associated with each, which varied significantly depending on the era, region, and type of tea. Each method, dictated by tradition and personal preference, had its own subtle variations in process and required attention to detail, adding another layer of repetitive, focused action and specific ritual to the routine. The scholar might have a specific routine for preparing their preferred type of tea at specific times of the day. A quirky tidbit that adds a touch of personal variation and sometimes eccentricity to the tea routine is that some scholars and tea connoisseurs developed very specific, perhaps overly particular, preferences and beliefs regarding the type of water used to brew their tea, believing it was as crucial to the final flavor and quality as the leaves themselves. They might claim that water from a particular mountain spring known for its purity, a specific section of a famous river, or even morning dew collected from certain types of plants like lotus leaves produce the absolute best flavor and enhance the tea's beneficial properties. Imagine the effort involved for a dedicated scholar in sourcing, perhaps even traveling some distance to collect water deemed worthy of their precious tea leaves, or relying on someone else to do it for them with strict instructions. A dedication to minute, seemingly obsessive details, all for a perfect cup of tea. A peak scholarly quirk? Historians still argue about the extent to which tea drinking was a truly universal practice among scholars of all economic levels and social standing throughout Chinese history, or if access to quality tea, specific teaware, and the leisure time required to appreciate the ritual was primarily a marker of status, wealth, and cultural refinement enjoyed primarily by the affluent literati. Was it a truly ubiquitous part of the scholarly routine for everyone who called themselves a scholar, regardless of their means, or an ideal more fully realized by those with greater resources? This debate touches on the social realities of tea consumption and how it intersected with class. But the ideal of tea as a scholarly aid, a focus for contemplation, a partner in creativity, and a ritual of calm was deeply ingrained in the culture and literature. So, as you picture the ancient scholar preparing and slowly sipping their hot tea, seated in their study or a quiet garden pavilion, move past the idea of just grabbing a drink for thirst or a quick caffeine fix. See the deliberate ritual, the focused attention on the sensory details, the warmth of the cup in their hands, the subtle aroma rising, the nuanced taste on their tongue, the visual beauty of the leaves. It's a repetitive, calming practice that punctuates the hours of study, providing moments of sensory engagement, warmth, focus, and quiet contemplation. That steady, gentle act of preparing and sipping tea, the quiet sounds of water and leaves, the feeling of warmth spreading within. It's a very sensory, very calming process to contemplate, predictable and comforting in its repetition, perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift. Just the quiet sounds of water and leaves. Steeping, sipping, sleepily. You've enjoyed the calming ritual of preparing and sipping tea, that predictable pause in the day's studies, feeling the warmth and subtle flavors ground you in the present moment. While much of the ancient Chinese scholars' day was indeed spent in quiet solitude, immersed in texts and the solitary practice of calligraphy or playing the guqin, their routines also included structured social interactions. These weren't typically casual, spontaneous hangouts in the way we might meet up with friends today. They were often more formal events, governed by established etiquette, and they served important specific purposes within the scholarly and social world: intellectual exchange, seeking or offering patronage, networking for official positions, fulfilling social obligations, or simply sharing the quiet company of like-minded individuals. The formal, often predictable, nature of these visits and the conversations they involved added another layer of structured, albeit sometimes socially demanding, predictability to their week or month. Imagine the scene as an ancient Chinese scholar, Receive a visitor in your study, or perhaps you are making a visit to the home or study of a fellow scholar, a respected elder, a potential patron, or an official. The interaction would likely begin with formal greetings, bowing according to established social hierarchy and politeness. If you were the host, the ritual of preparing and serving tea would almost certainly follow, a crucial part of hospitality and a way to initiate conversation in a calm, focused manner. The conversation itself would often revolve around expected, appropriate topics within the scholarly sphere, discussions about classical texts, interpretations of philosophy, sharing recently composed poetry or pieces of calligraphy, polite inquiries about each other's studies or well-being, and perhaps, if trust and context allowed, subtle discussions about current events or the complexities of navigating the world outside the study walls. These structured interactions provided essential opportunities for scholars to step outside their solitary work and engage with the wider intellectual community. It was a chance to test their ideas, discuss challenging interpretations of text with peers or elders, share their latest poems or pieces of calligraphy to receive feedback and admiration, and stay abreast of intellectual trends and scholarly gossip. For those aspiring to official careers within the imperial bureaucracy, visiting influential scholars, potential patrons, or established officials was absolutely crucial for building connections. Demonstrating their knowledge, manners, and talent in a social setting, and potentially gaining recommendations or support for securing a position. It was a form of essential networking, ancient Chinese style, often conducted with multiple layers of elaborate politeness, subtle communication, and careful adherence to social protocols. A mainstream historical fact highlighting the profound importance of these social networks and interactions for personal and professional advancement in ancient Chinese society is the concept of guanji guanxi, which broadly refers to the networks of relationships and connections built through social interactions. While the imperial examination system theoretically selected officials based on merit through blind grading of exams, in practice, personal connections, recommendations from respected figures, and relationships built through these structured social visits and interactions played a very significant role in gaining recognition, securing positions, and navigating the complex world of officialdom once appointed. Social visits, gift exchanges, and participation in scholarly gatherings were therefore not just pleasantries or intellectual pursuits. They were often strategic necessities, part of the long-term effort to build the social capital needed for a successful scholarly and official career. Consider the rhythm and predictability of these visits. They might occur at specific times of day, often in the late morning or afternoon, and were usually arranged in advance through messengers or formal invitations. The conversation, while sometimes intellectually stimulating, would likely follow certain predictable patterns, starting with polite inquiries and formalities, moving to scholarly or artistic topics expected of cultured individuals, perhaps including moments for appreciating art or calligraphy together, and potentially concluding with the exchange of gifts or invitations for future visits or gatherings. It added a layer of predictable social choreography to their lives, less like a casual modern coffee chat, and more like a series of semi-formal meetings with intellectual and social objectives. You knew, generally, how the visit would flow, what topics would be appropriate, and what was expected of you as a host or guest. A quirky tidbit that adds a touch of personal variation and sometimes highlights the tension between scholarly solitude and social obligation is that while many scholars diligently participated in these structured visits, some developed reputations for being either exceptionally skilled and graceful at navigating these complex social interactions, masters of polite conversation, subtle flattery, and strategic networking, or conversely, notoriously reclusive, awkward, or even deliberately blunt. Preferring the quiet solitude of their study to company, some might choose to communicate primarily through letters, poems exchanged from afar, or occasional formal invitations, effectively minimizing face-to-face encounters, while others actively cultivated their social circle and hosted regular gatherings in their studies or gardens that became important, albeit often formal intellectual salons and networking hubs. There are stories of scholars who deliberately made themselves difficult to visit, adding a certain mystique to their reclusiveness, while others thrived on the constant stream of visitors and invitations. Historians still argue about the extent to which genuine, deep intellectual exchange and heartfelt personal connection occurred during these structured social visits versus the interaction being primarily performative, focused on displaying one's knowledge, eloquence, artistic sensibility, and adherence to complex social norms for strategic purposes. Was it truly about debating profound ideas, sharing sincere artistic expression, and building deep, lasting friendships with like-minded individuals, or more about showcasing one's scholarly credentials, social grace, and potential usefulness to a patron or colleague? This debate touches on the authenticity and deeper meaning of these social interactions within the context of scholarly ambition and social hierarchy. But the daily or weekly reality for many scholars involved participating in these structured, predictable social routines. So, as you picture the ancient scholar engaging in a polite, perhaps slightly formal conversation over tea with a visitor in their study or garden pavilion, move past the idea of casual hangouts. See the structured interaction, the adherence to established etiquette, the careful choice of words, the underlying social, intellectual, or even political purpose of the visit. It's a predictable social rhythm, a defined pattern of engagement that punctuated their solitary study, providing necessary connection but within a controlled framework. That steady, polite exchange of words and ideas, perhaps accompanied by the serving of tea and the appreciation of calligraphy or paintings. It's a very calm, often formal process to contemplate, predictable and structured, perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift. Just the gentle murmur of scholarly discussion, the quiet clinking of teacups, repeating, sleepily. You've navigated the structured social landscape of guest visits, performing the rituals of greeting, tea service, and polite conversation, perhaps feeling the subtle pressures of networking or intellectual performance. Now, let's step outside the confines of the study and the drawing room and enter another space that was integral to the ancient Chinese scholars' routine, the garden or the natural landscape. Spending time contemplating nature wasn't just a simple leisurely stroll or a quick breath of fresh air. It was often a deliberate, deeply ingrained, philosophical practice, a source of inspiration, a refuge from the demands of academic rigor and urban life, and a crucial way for scholars to connect with deeper principles and cultivate their inner peace. The quiet contemplation of gardens, landscapes, and natural phenomena provided a calming, predictable counterpoint to their demanding intellectual and social lives. Imagine the scholar stepping out of their study or home and walking slowly and deliberately in a carefully designed garden, perhaps their own relatively small courtyard garden, or that of a friend, patron, or a public temple or scenic spot. These gardens were rarely wild, untamed spaces, though scholars might visit natural landscapes too. They were meticulously curated, miniature landscapes designed to evoke the feeling of vast mountains, rivers, and forests within a limited space. They often featured carefully selected and arranged rocks to resemble majestic mountains or rugged cliffs, ponds or streams representing lakes or flowing water, and strategically placed plants, trees, and flowers chosen not just for their beauty but also for their symbolic meaning, like the resilience of bamboo, the endurance of pine, the purity of plum blossoms. Walking along winding paths, pausing by a strategically placed rock formation, sitting quietly by a pond to observe the movement of fish or the reflections on the water, listening to the sound of a small waterfall or the wind in the trees. These were not random actions but deliberate acts of observation, reflection, and engagement with the natural world as interpreted and presented in the garden. Nature was seen as a fundamental source of aesthetic beauty, but more importantly, as a living embodiment of philosophical truth and moral lessons, reflecting the principles of the Tao the Way and the natural order of the cosmos. The cycles of the seasons, the growth and decay of plants, the flow of water, the steadfastness of mountains. These were all seen as manifestations of universal principles that the scholars sought to understand and harmonize with. Contemplating these natural forms was a way of seeking inspiration for poetry and painting, finding perspective amidst the demanding world of human affairs, the complexities of classical texts, and the frustrations of the bureaucracy, and ultimately, cultivating inner tranquility and a connection to something larger than themselves. A mainstream historical fact that profoundly highlights the importance of this practice is that garden design was a highly developed and revered art form in ancient China, particularly appreciated and patronized by scholars and officials. Gardens were considered not just decorative spaces for leisure, but as extensions of the scholar's study and inner world. Carefully crafted environments intended to facilitate contemplation, artistic inspiration, philosophical reflection, and gathering with a select few like-minded friends for conversation, tea, or artistic pursuits. They were designed to evoke the feeling of vast natural landscapes in miniature, create a sense of tranquility and harmony, and provide a crucial connection to nature, even within an urban or semi-urban setting. Bringing the calming influence of the natural world into the scholar's daily reach. Consider the deep sensory experience of these deliberate moments spent in nature or a garden. The clean scent of flowering plants, damp earth after rain, or the specific aroma of pine or bamboo. The subtle sounds of water trickling from a rockery, splashing into a pond, or flowing in a stream. The gentle rustle of leaves in a breeze, the chirping of insects or birds, the feel of the air on your skin, the texture of weathered rock under your hand, the coolness of water if you dipped your fingers, the visual harmony and balance of the designed landscape, the vibrant colors of flowers against the muted greens and grays of rocks and ink-like trees, the play of light and shadow. It was a deliberate engagement of multiple senses, providing a different kind of input and a different kind of rest for the mind compared to the abstract world of texts and ideas. A sensory anchor to the present moment and the natural world. A quirky tidbit that adds a touch of personal detail and sometimes highlights the deep connection scholars felt with specific natural elements is that some scholars were known to have very specific favorite spots within gardens or natural landscapes, a particular rock formation they would sit on for contemplation, a specific view of a distant mountain peak framed perfectly by trees, a quiet pavilion tucked away by a pond where they would spend hours reading, writing poetry, playing the guqin, or simply observing the changing light and weather. They might even give poetic names to these favored spots: the stone of listening to pines, the pavilion of floating green, the terrace for gazing at clouds, and write numerous poems, specifically inspired by these locations and the feelings or insights they experienced there, creating a deeply personal geography of meaning within the space based on their moments of quiet reflection. It's like having your thinking spot, but elevated to an art form. Historians still argue about the extent to which this contemplation of nature was a genuinely deep, philosophical or spiritual practice for all scholars across different eras and social strata, versus being, for some, a fashionable affectation, a culturally expected activity performed to demonstrate one's refinement, sensibility, and adherence to scholarly ideals, particularly during certain periods. Was it always a profound engagement with universal principles and a search for inner peace? Or was it sometimes simply what cultured individuals did to maintain appearances and participate in scholarly society? This debate touches on the authenticity and depth of the practice for individuals, but the daily or weekly reality for many scholars, particularly the more affluent ones with access to gardens or leisure time, involved spending dedicated time in these natural or semi-natural spaces, engaged in quiet observation and contemplation as a predictable and valued part of their routine. So, as you picture the ancient scholar walking slowly and deliberately through a garden, pausing by a rock, sitting quietly by a pond, or gazing at a distant mountain peak, move past the idea of just enjoying the scenery in a casual way. See the deliberate act of contemplation, the search for meaning and inspiration, the quiet connection with the natural world, a conscious effort to find tranquility, perspective, and harmony outside the study walls and the pressures of society. It's a predictable pause in the intellectual day, a shift in focus to the organic rhythms and subtle beauties of nature, a form of active rest for the mind, that steady, quiet observation of the garden or landscape, the gentle rustle of leaves, the subtle sounds of water, the feeling of the breeze. It's a very sensory, very calming process to contemplate, predictable in its occurrence, perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift. Just the quiet presence of nature, it's of breathing, resting, sleepily. You've spent time contemplating the quiet beauty and philosophical principles embodied in nature, finding a sense of peace and perspective in the deliberate observation of gardens and landscapes. This engagement with the aesthetic and symbolic world extended beyond nature for ancient Chinese scholars. They often incorporated the practice of other arts and music into their routines. These weren't merely casual hobbies or forms of entertainment in the modern sense. Designed primarily for amusement, like calligraphy, which we discussed earlier, they were seen as crucial forms of self-cultivation, ways to refine one's character, express emotions and insights too subtle or personal for straightforward communication, and connect with deeper aesthetic and philosophical principles. The regular practice of music, painting, or composing poetry provided calming, creative outlets and predictable activities that offered a different kind of focus and satisfaction compared to the rigorous demands of academic study and navigating the social or political world. Imagine a scholar sitting quietly in their study or a serene garden pavilion, carefully tuning and then playing the guqian, a seven-stringed zither. This ancient instrument, with its long history and association with learned individuals, was considered the instrument of the literati par excellence. Playing the guqian was typically a solitary or intimate activity, performed for personal contemplation or for a very small number of close and unappreciative friends, not before large audiences. The music produced was often understated, subtle, and deeply expressive, focused on nuances of tone, resonance, and emotional depth rather than dramatic melodies or complex harmonies. The act of tuning the instrument a precise and patient task requiring a good ear and fine adjustments. The focused positioning of the hands and fingers, the specific techniques of plucking or stroking the silk strings to produce different sounds, and the quiet concentration required to follow the musical notation or improvise. This was a focused, physical, auditory, and deeply repetitive routine in itself, requiring immense discipline to master but offering a calming, almost meditative process. Painting, particularly landscape painting, shan shui, meaning mountain water, and the painting of birds. Flowers and bamboo was another common and highly valued artistic pursuit among scholars. Using ink and brush, the same fundamental tools as calligraphy, highlighting the interconnectedness of these arts. Scholars would capture the essence of nature, express their inner feelings or moods, or illustrate philosophical concepts through visual means. The process involved preparing the ink and brush, choosing the right paper or silk, carefully planning the composition even if seemingly spontaneous, and then executing it with slow, deliberate strokes and washes of ink. The focus required to apply the ink washes to create depth and texture, the balance between empty space and form, the capturing of the spirit of the subject. This was a quiet, visual, physical, and deeply contemplative creative process, often done in silence or accompanied only by the soft sounds of brush on paper and the subtle aroma of ink. A mainstream historical fact that profoundly highlights the importance of these artistic and musical pursuits in scholarly life is that mastery of the guqian, skill in painting, ability to compose poetry, and proficiency in the strategy board game. Go Weiki were, alongside calligraphy, considered the four arts expected accomplishments for a cultivated gentleman yunzi throughout many dynasties. These arts were seen not just as separate skills but as deeply interconnected forms of cultivation, drawing on similar principles of discipline, focus, aesthetic sensibility, brush control for calligraphy and painting, composition, rhythm, and the expression of one's inner spirit qui and moral character. They were considered integral to the ideal of the yunzi, whose cultivation was seen as simultaneously moral, intellectual, and aesthetic. Consider the emotional outlet these arts provided. While academic scholarship demanded logic, rigorous memorization, and adherence to established texts and interpretations, music, painting, and poetry offered spaces for more personal expression of feelings, subtle moods, insights, and even frustrations in a nonverbal or indirect way. Playing a melancholic melody on the guqian after a frustrating day, painting a solitary figure in a vast, empty landscape to express feelings of isolation, or composing a poem filled with subtle allusions to express political dissatisfaction could be powerful ways of processing emotions. Reflecting on life's complexities or communicating things that could not be said directly, providing a necessary balance to the more formal and demanding aspects of scholarly life. A quirky tidbit that adds a touch of personal variation and sometimes highlights the creative flow within their disciplined routines is that some scholars would deliberately combine their artistic pursuits in interesting and unique ways as part of their routine. Some would paint a scene, a landscape, bamboo, a scholar's rock, and then write a poem directly onto the painting itself. In their own calligraphy, often balancing the visual composition of the painting with the placement and style of the written characters, effectively blurring the lines between the visual art, the literary art, and the art of writing into a single piece. Others would compose music specifically inspired by a particular landscape they had visited, or a poem they had read, or create a painting based on the emotions evoked by a piece of Guqin music. This interweaving and cross-pollination of different artistic routines shows a creative flow and interconnectedness within their otherwise highly structured and disciplined lives. Historians still argue about the extent to which proficiency and engagement in these arts were a genuine expression of deep personal passion, inner feeling, and creative impulse for all scholars across different eras and social strata, versus being, for some, might by primarily a social expectation, a requirement to demonstrate one's cultured status, refinement, and suitability for elite society and its social circles. Was it always a profound personal engagement with artistic expression? Or was it sometimes diligently performing a learned skill expected of their class to maintain appearances and participate in the cultured world of the literati? This debate touches on the authenticity and motivation behind the practice of these arts, but the daily or weekly reality for many scholars, particularly those of the literati class, involved spending dedicated time in these quiet, creative, and often repetitive routines of practice and composition. So, as you picture the ancient scholar quietly playing the guqin, their fingers moving deliberately over the strings, or carefully applying ink to paper to create a painting, their brush guided by focus and intent, or sitting with a scroll, composing lines of poetry in their mind, move past the idea of grand artistic performance for an audience. See the quiet practice, the focused creation, the expression of inner feeling and connection to aesthetic principles through subtle sounds, controlled movements, and visual forms. It's a calming, creative rhythm, a different kind of focus than their academic studies or social obligations, but equally disciplined and often repetitive in its practice. That steady, gentle act of making music, painting, or composing. The quiet notes of the zither, the whisper of the brush, the shaping of words. It's a very sensory, very calming process to contemplate, predictable in its place within the routine, perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift. Just the soft sounds of creative practice, repeating, sleepily. You've explored the calming creative outlets of music and painting, practices that provided a different kind of focus and expression compared to the rigorous academic study. As the day progresses into the afternoon, having perhaps already completed hours of reading aloud, calligraphy, and perhaps even a structured social visit or time contemplating nature, the ancient Chinese scholars' routine would often incorporate a crucial and, for the purposes of a sleep podcast, particularly relevant element, the midday nap. Unlike some cultures or modern work ethics where napping might be frowned upon or seen as a sign of laziness, a short period of rest during the middle of the day was an accepted, practical, and often encouraged part of the scholarly and even official routine in ancient China, believed to refresh the mind and body for continued productivity and focus in the afternoon and evening. Imagine the scholar, having risen before dawn and spent the morning engaged in demanding intellectual and physical tasks, perhaps feeling the natural dip in energy that often occurs after the midday meal, especially during the warmer months or after hours of intense concentration. Instead of simply pushing through exhaustion, trying to power through with sheer willpower or strong stimulants beyond their tea, of course, they would deliberately and purposefully take time to rest. This might involve finding a quiet spot in their study, a reclined chair, a simple daybed, or even just reclining comfortably on a mat or cushion on the floor. If they were in an academy or a government office for those who held positions, there might even be designated areas or allowances for taking a brief midday rest. The midday nap, known as wushui wushui, literally midday sleep or wugzi wuga, midday rest, was not necessarily intended to be a long, deep, hours-long period of unconsciousness, which could potentially leave one feeling groggy or disoriented upon waking. Instead, it was often a period of quiet repose, a deliberate stillness, allowing the mind to disengage from the demands of study and the body to recover from the morning's efforts. It could range from a very brief period of simply closing their eyes, clearing their thoughts, and relaxing their muscles to a short, restorative sleep, lasting perhaps 20 minutes to an hour. The specific length and depth of the nap would likely vary depending on the individual's needs, the demands of their schedule, and their personal habits. However, the underlying goal was consistent to wake up feeling refreshed, with a clearer mind, reduced mental fatigue, and renewed energy and focus, ready to resume their studies, administrative tasks, or other duties in the afternoon. A mainstream historical fact is that across various dynasties in Chinese history, from at least the Tang period onwards and likely earlier, texts, poems, and anecdotal accounts mention scholars, officials, monks, and even emperors taking midday rests. This indicates that the midday nap was a recognized, accepted, and relatively common practice across different segments of educated and working society, particularly for those whose work involved long hours of mental focus. It was seen not as an indulgence but as a practical and beneficial habit for maintaining sustained mental performance over a long day, especially given that working days often began very early. It was a form of scheduled, productive downtime. Consider the feeling of deliberately pausing your work or studies in the middle of the day to rest. It's a conscious decision to prioritize physical and mental recovery, recognizing that taking a break can actually enhance overall productivity and clarity in the long run. The quietness that often falls over a household, an academy, or even parts of a government office during the hottest part of the midday, the feeling of letting go of the morning's intellectual intensity and allowing your mind and body to simply be still for a while, free from demands or the need to concentrate. It's a moment of simple, quiet surrender to the need for rest. A quirky tidbit that adds a touch of personal variation and sometimes highlights the habit's ingrained nature is that some scholars were said to have very specific preferences or seemingly unusual abilities related to their midday nap. Some might only be able to nap effectively in a particular spot in their study, perhaps leaning back in their favorite chair or on a specific mat, finding comfort and ease in the familiarity of the location. Others were reputedly able to fall asleep almost instantly whenever they decided it was time for a nap, a skill born of habit, discipline, and perhaps sheer mental or physical exhaustion from rigorous study. Imagine being able to just consciously decide to take a 20-minute nap and immediately drift off. That kind of immediate transition to rest is a superpower many of us could only dream of possessing. Historians still argue about the average length and quality of sleep, both nighttime sleep and midday naps, in ancient China compared to modern times. Factors like different lifestyles, diets, patterns of work, and importantly, limited artificial lighting at night, meaning nights were often longer and darker, potentially leading to earlier bedtimes but also possibly interrupted sleep, likely impacted overall sleep patterns. While the midday nap is well documented, was it primarily a necessary supplement to compensate for potentially shorter or more interrupted nighttime sleep due to early starts and limited lighting for evening activities? Or was it seen as a distinct strategy to effectively break up and optimize a potentially very long day of focused work and study that stretched from pre-dawn into the evening? This debate touches on the broader sleep habits and challenges of the time. But the midday rest itself was a distinct, documented, and valued part of the scholarly routine, a predictable period of stillness. So, as you picture the ancient scholar taking their midday nap, perhaps reclining in their study chair, eyes closed, breathing slowing, move past any idea of indulgence or laziness. See the deliberate choice to rest, the quiet period of repose amidst the demanding routine, a conscious effort to recharge the mind and body. It's a predictable pause in the day, a moment of allowed stillness and recovery, a small, scheduled break from the relentless pursuit of knowledge. That steady, deliberate act of lying down to rest, the quiet breathing, the feeling of letting go of thoughts and demands for a brief period. It's a very calming, very familiar, and very relatable process, perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift. Just the gentle quiet of midday rest, breathing, resting, sleepily. You've experienced the quiet, restorative power of the midday nap, a sensible and accepted part of the ancient Chinese scholars' routine designed to refresh the mind and body for the afternoon's continued intellectual efforts. As the afternoon progresses and begins to transition into evening, and the natural light outside begins to fade, the scholar's routine would typically shift towards concluding the most rigorous and demanding aspects of their studies and preparing for rest. The evening hours were often dedicated to a different kind of intellectual engagement, less about intense, now focused memorization of new material or tackling difficult new concepts, and more about reviewing the day's work, organizing materials, engaging in lighter reading or writing, and quiet reflection. This winding down process added another crucial layer of predictable calm and reduced intensity to the end of their academic day, a gentle transition towards the period of rest. Imagine the change in the atmosphere within the scholar's study as the day turns into evening. As the sun begins its descent towards the horizon, the natural light coming through windows or open doorways would diminish, and the study would become progressively dimmer. Relying solely on the fading natural light would become insufficient for detailed reading or fine calligraphy. Lamplight, typically from oil lamps, would become necessary to illuminate the workspace. The scholar would light their lamps, and the room would take on a warmer, perhaps slightly flickering, glow, creating more intimate pools of light on the desk and surrounding areas, while the corners of the room might recede into deeper shadow. The activities typically pursued during these evening hours were often less taxing than the intense verbatim memorization and meticulous fine calligraphy practiced in the well-lit morning and afternoon. This period was more about processing, consolidating, and gently engaging with the material, reviewing notes taken during the day, rereading passages of text already studied to reinforce memory and understanding, organizing scrolls and books used during the day, or copying out favorite passages of classical prose or poetry into a personal collection could all be part of the evening routine. It was a period for solidification of learning, gentle practice to keep the mind engaged without undue strain, and preparing materials for the next day's study. It wasn't the primary time for tackling completely new, dense texts, as the reduced light made sustained, intense concentration on fine details more challenging. A mainstream historical fact is that while daylight hours were considered crucial for primary study, demanding tasks requiring fine detail work and official duties, the evening hours, illuminated by lamps, typically oil lamps using plant-based oils or animal fats, often provided a quieter, though less brightly lit, time for different kinds of intellectual activity. The quality and duration of illumination from ancient lamps limited the ability to perform very fine, visually demanding work for extended periods compared to working in natural daylight. This limitation naturally encouraged a shift towards activities like quiet reading if the print was large enough or familiar, reflection, writing letters, composing poetry which could be done less meticulously than formal essays, or engaging in less demanding intellectual pursuits. The rhythm of the day was, to a significant extent, dictated by the availability and quality of light. Consider the quiet atmosphere of the study in the evening. The sounds of the wider household would likely be settling down as family members or fellow residents prepared for their own evening activities or early bedtime. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls and across the desk, creating a more intimate, perhaps even slightly mysterious, contemplative space. The air might still carry the subtle sense of ink and paper from the day's work, perhaps mixed with the faint, specific smell of lamp oil as the wick burns, or the lingering aroma of incense if it was burned earlier. These familiar sensory details contributed to the predictable, calming environment of the evening routine. A quirky tidbit is that some scholars would make a point of ending their formal studies each evening with a specific, small personal ritual that signaled the conclusion of the demanding academic day and marked the transition towards rest or personal time. This might involve reading a passage from a particular philosophical text that offered comfort, inspiration, or a summary of ethical principles, or perhaps writing a single piece of calligraphy, a favorite character, a short phrase, or a summary of their thoughts for the day, as a final act before putting away their tools. This created a small, personal closing ceremony, a predictable way to signal to themselves and their mind that the formal period of demanding study was over, allowing them to transition more easily towards relaxation and rest. It's like having a specific wind-down activity you do every night to tell your brain it's time to stop thinking about work. Historians still argue about the balance between evening study and other activities like socializing if guests were present late, which was less common than daytime visits, spending time with family if the scholar was married or lived with relatives, or engaging in purely personal leisure activities, especially for scholars who were also officials and had significant family or social responsibilities that demanded their attention in the evening. Was the evening primarily dedicated to continued intellectual work, albeit in a less intense mode, or was it a time primarily for personal life, relaxation, and social connection outside of academic pursuits? This debate touches on the different demands on a scholar's time depending on their life stage and status, but for dedicated scholars, some period of quiet evening intellectual engagement, review, or reflection was likely a predictable and valued part of their routine, a gentle conclusion to the day's learning. So, as you picture the ancient scholar in their study in the evening, the lamplight casting a warm, soft glow on their desk, move past the idea of constant, intense, never-ending work stretching late into the night limited by lighting anyway. See the shift towards review, reflection, and quieter, less demanding intellectual pursuits. It's a predictable winding down, a gentle easing of the intellectual pace, a natural transition towards the end of the active day. That steady, quiet process of reviewing, organizing, or engaging with text in a more relaxed way. The soft light of the lamp, the familiar, quiet scents, the rustle of paper. It's a very calming, very peaceful process to contemplate, predictable in its occurrence each evening, perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift. Just the gentle glow of the lamp, illuminating the familiar characters. Sleepily, you've settled into the gentle rhythm of the scholar's evening routine, reviewing the day's learning by lamplight, a quiet transition towards rest after the daytime's demanding work. While we've explored the shared, common routines that structured the lives of ancient Chinese scholars, the early rising, the meticulous preparation, the rhythmic recitation, the disciplined calligraphy, the simple meals, the calming tea, the structured visits, the quiet contemplation of nature, the artistic pursuits, the necessary midday naps, and the winding down in the evening. It's important to remember that even within this highly disciplined and often conforming framework, individual scholars were just that, individuals, and history, particularly through anecdotes, personal writings, and biographical accounts, has preserved fascinating glimpses into some of the specific, sometimes quite peculiar or even eccentric, quirks that individual scholars incorporated into their daily habits. These documented eccentricities add a touch of individual charm to the historical picture and highlight that even within a life dedicated to rigid tradition and demanding routine, personal habits could be wonderfully unique, persistent, and from our modern perspective, delightfully quirky. Imagine tales passed down through centuries about scholars whose dedication manifested in unusual habits. Perhaps a scholar who had an absolutely obsessive need to arrange their extensive collection of scrolls and books in a highly specific, often unconventional order that defied typical categorization and made perfect sense only to them, a kind of personal library code that no one else could decipher. Or those renowned calligraphers who insisted on using only ink ground at a particular temperature, achieved through some intricate, almost alchemical method involving precise measurements of water and specific grinding times. Believing this exact preparation was crucial for achieving the perfect consistency and spirit in their ink. There are stories of scholars who, seeking specific inspiration or a particular state of mind, would only read certain crucial philosophical texts or compose poetry while sitting under a specific, favored ancient tree in a garden or on a particular rock, known for its unique shape or location. Regardless of the weather, integrating their physical environment into their intellectual ritual, these weren't typically random behaviors. They were often deeply ingrained habits, rituals developed over years, that the individual scholar believed were essential for their focus, their creativity, their connection to the material, or even their well-being or luck, particularly in relation to passing exams or achieving recognition. They might seem odd, unnecessary, or even slightly obsessive to us today, but for the scholar, they were part of the personal architecture of their routine, minor deviations from the general norm that made their scholarly life uniquely their own, a kind of personal superstition, comfort mechanism, or deeply felt ritual. It's like having a specific lucky pen you must use for tests, but instead it's a specific, weird way you must grind ink for a certain type of writing. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the complex relationship between conformity and individuality in ancient Chinese culture, particularly for the literati class. While adherence to Confucian social norms, respect for tradition, and mastery of established literary and artistic forms were crucial for social acceptance and professional advancement, there was also a parallel cultural value placed on cultivating one's unique voice, personal style, and individual perspective, particularly in later periods. This striving for individuality, sometimes subtle, sometimes more pronounced, could manifest not only in a scholar's distinctive artistic or literary style, but also, seemingly, in their personal habits and documented eccentricities, which were often recorded and shared as defining characteristics of famous individuals, showing that even within the structured life, personality found a way to express itself. Consider the specific sensory details associated with these individual quirks, how they might have anchored the scholar's routine in highly personal sensory experiences. The particular scent of a preferred blend of incense burned only during the reading of a specific author's work. The unique tactile feel of a particular type of paper that had to be used for copying certain texts because of its texture and absorbency. The exact muscle memory required for the specific angle at which the writing brush had to be held to achieve the calligraphic flow that felt right to that individual. The taste of a specific type of tea brewed only in a certain pot at a certain time of day, using a specific, personally sourced water that they believed possessed unique qualities. These small sensory rituals, repeated consistently, became deeply comforting, necessary, and uniquely defining markers of the individual scholar's personal routine within the broader structure. A quirky tidbit, often shared as an amusing or illustrative anecdote in historical texts and collections of stories about famous figures, tells of scholars who were so deeply engrossed in their studies and writing that they occasionally confused their actions related to their work with their basic daily needs, highlighting their extreme focus and the power of ingrained habit. One such famous story, often attributed to different historical figures, describes a scholar who, while eating a meal and simultaneously engrossed in writing calligraphy, absent-mindedly dipped his steamed bun into his inkstone instead of a dish of food or sauce. His mind so completely focused on the characters he was forming with the brush that he momentarily confused the familiar black ink in the inkstone for a condiment on his plate. He would then, presumably, take a bite of a very inky bun. While likely exaggerated for comedic or illustrative effect, emphasizing the scholar's dedication and absent-mindedness, it perfectly captures the image of a mind so consumed by routine and focus that it overlooks basic physical reality, a rather charming and slightly messy eccentricity born of deep, pervasive habit. Historians still argue about the accuracy, origins, and significance of many of these specific, anecdotal quirks attributed to famous scholars. Were they genuine daily habits meticulously followed by these individuals, or were they, at least in some cases, literary embellishments, colorful stories invented or exaggerated over time by biographers and storytellers to illustrate a scholar's legendary dedication, intense focus, unique personality, or even absent-mindedness in a memorable way? This debate touches on the nature of historical storytelling, the creation of biographical legends, and the difficulty of separating fact from anecdote in ancient sources. However, the very fact that these stories were told, recorded, and circulated across centuries suggests a cultural fascination with the specific, sometimes odd, routines and habits that defined individual scholars as unique personalities within a generally conformist system, and which were seen as intrinsically linked to their scholarly identity and achievements. So, as you picture these ancient scholars and their personal eccentricities, the precise perhaps unusual way they held their brush that was slightly different from everyone else's. The specific type of incense they burned only when reading a particular author. The odd system they used to arrange their books that looked like visual chaos but was their personal order. The belief in the magic of water from a certain spring. Move past the idea of just strange behavior. See the personal ritual. The deeply ingrained habit. The unique, sometimes peculiar way each individual navigated the demands and routines of their scholarly life. Finding comfort, focus, and perhaps a sense of personal control and identity in their unique quirks. That steady adherence to personal quirks, however odd they might seem to us today, it's a very human, very specific kind of routine, layered onto the broader shared habits. And it's perfect for helping your own mind settle down and drift by contemplating these small, peculiar details. Just the thought of these unique little habits. Repeating, repeating, sleepily. You've had a glimpse into the fascinating world of ancient Chinese scholars, exploring not just the grand pursuits of knowledge and official ambition, but the granular details of their daily lives. We've walked through their early mornings before the sun touched the horizon, observed their simple but deliberate personal grooming rituals, seen them meticulously prepare their studies, heard the rhythmic chanting of classical texts echoing through the quiet air, watched the steady, focused hand mastering the art of calligraphy stroke by repetitive stroke, shared their simple, scheduled meals and appreciated the calming ritual of preparing and sipping tea, observed their structured, social interactions and the subtle choreography of politeness, contemplated nature in their carefully designed gardens or vast landscapes, appreciated the quiet, expressive sounds of their music, played on the guqin and the visual tranquility of their ink paintings, noted their sensible and accepted midday naps for rest and recovery, and witnessed their quieter evenings of review and reflection before concluding the academic day, all punctuated by their unique and sometimes wonderfully peculiar personal quirks that made each scholar's routine distinctly their own. And perhaps, just perhaps, as you have patiently followed along with these detailed explorations of predictable habits, repetitive actions, and meticulous steps, you've begun to feel the surprisingly profound calming power of these historical routines washing over you. The fundamental goal here, after all, wasn't to present a dramatic historical narrative filled with conflict, battles, political intrigue, or sudden shocking events designed to keep you on the edge of your seat and your mind racing. Instead, it was deliberately designed to soothe and calm your busy mind by presenting an angle of history, the quiet, consistent, daily habits of individuals, that is inherently less exciting, more predictable, and filled with details that encourage the mind to relax, to let go of anticipation rather than to become more stimulated. The absence of constant, high-stakes drama, the pervasive presence of historical mundaneness, albeit a culturally rich mundaneness, and the consistent focus on repetitive tasks and predictable rhythms are precisely what make this topic so incredibly suitable. So perfectly effective, for helping you wind down, quiet your thoughts, and prepare for sleep. Think about the mental state that is most conducive to falling asleep. You need to quiet the internal chatter, dampen the mental stimulation, release the tension built up during your own modern day, and let go of the need to follow complex plots or solve problems. Focusing on stories filled with action, suspense, unpredictable turns, emotional intensity, or visually jarring events does the exact opposite. It engages your mind fully, triggers alertness, raises your heart rate, and keeps you mentally anticipating what might happen next. But a narrative focused on the overwhelming but ultimately ordered data of a scholar's numerous daily habits, the predictable rhythm of a specific way of reciting a text, the repetitive physical motions of grinding ink and painting characters, the scheduled simplicity of meals and tea breaks, the quiet contemplation that follows a familiar path in a garden, the accepted period of stillness during a midday nap, the gentle winding down of the evening routine, and even the comforting, if odd, predictability of a scholar's personal quirks. These are details and rhythms that encourage a completely different kind of mental state. They are predictable, relatable in their underlying human need for structure and habit, even if the specifics are ancient and quirky, and repetitive enough that your mind can disengage from the need to follow a complex plot or remember intricate details and instead simply float along on the familiar, gentle rhythm of the routine, like a small boat on a calm, unchanging river. A mainstream historical fact that subtly supports this idea of finding calm and meaning in routine and connects the scholar's life to broader cultural values is that throughout Chinese history, particularly deeply influenced by Confucian and Taoist philosophies, the ideal of a well-cultivated life, even when pursued alongside demanding official duties, was often associated with values of tranquility, harmony with nature, moderation, discipline, and inner peace Ningjing Jujing or Pinghe Pinghe. These ideals were not just abstract concepts discussed in texts, they were actively pursued, cultivated, and reinforced through the structured, often contemplative, and inherently repetitive nature of their daily routines. The routine wasn't solely about achieving external success in exams or office, it was also, fundamentally, about shaping the inner self, cultivating moral character, and achieving a state of inner calm and balance in accordance with these deeply held philosophical values. The repetitive daily actions were a path to inner stillness. The lack of sudden dramatic or adrenaline-pumping details in this exploration of a scholar's routine means your mind doesn't feel the need to stay alert for danger or anticipate thrilling plot twists. There are no sudden attacks during a calligraphy session usually, no political coups unfolding during tea time, no monsters lurking in the study except maybe the daunting task of memorization itself. Instead, you're left with quiet images of focused, ongoing effort, predictable steps taken day after day, simple needs met, and the slow, steady accumulation of knowledge and character through consistent habit. It's the historical equivalent of watching a calm, repetitive process unfold, like weaving cloth or watching waves gently lap the shore, but applied to a human life. A quirky tidbit that perhaps uniquely captures this blend of deep routine, philosophical pursuit, and quiet personal experience is the idea that some scholars, as mentioned earlier, were said to keep personal journals or diaries that not only recorded external events or intellectual insights, but also reflected on their internal state, their adherence to their planned routine, and even the perceived quality of their focus and state of mind during specific activities like study or contemplation. They were, in a profound way, constantly observing and evaluating the quality of their routine itself and their internal experience of performing it, treating their daily habits as a subject of quiet, ongoing personal assessment and cultivation. This adds a layer of self-awareness to the repetition, turning the routine into a conscious path towards self-mastery and inner peace, a very dedicated form of journaling your way to tranquility. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of such rigorous, repetitive, and sometimes isolated routines on the scholars themselves over long periods. Did it consistently lead to the intended deep intellectual insight, a strong sense of discipline, and genuine inner peace? Or did it sometimes contribute to mental fatigue, monotony, stress, and a sense of confinement, particularly for those who did not achieve success in the exams or bureaucracy that justified the years of effort? This debate reminds us that historical realities and individual human experiences are complex and varied, and not every scholar's life was a picture of perfect serenity. However, for our purposes tonight, focusing on the calm, predictable surface of the routine, the quiet adherence to habit, the gentle repetition of actions, is precisely the point. It is in that surface predictability, that focus on repetitive, calming actions, that we find the soothing rhythm we seek to guide us towards sleep. So, as we close this exploration of the quiet, disciplined, and surprisingly quirky daily routines of ancient Chinese scholars, let the images settle softly in your mind, not the pressure of exams or the complexity of classical texts, but the quiet focus on small, deliberate actions, the predictable flow of the day from pre-dawn to evening, the gentle rhythms of repetition, the soft sound of the ink stick grinding, the quiet rustle of paper, the subtle whisper of the brush on silk, the steady sound of recitation, the simple taste of tea, the feeling of stillness during a midday nap, the quiet glow of the evening lamp. There are no more grand historical events to unfold tonight. No more dramatic figures or unexpected turns in this narrative of routine. Just the steady, quiet, and yes, slightly quirky routines of lives lived centuries ago, dedicated to learning, cultivation, and inner peace through the power of consistent, predictable habit. Let that quiet predictability, that sense of calm routine, wash over you now. Heavy and soothing, the ink, the brushes, the scrolls, the tea, the quiet walks, the midday rests, the evening lamp, all gently fading now, dissolving into the quiet. The study is dark now, the lamp extinguished, the inkstone is clean and dry, the brushes are put away, the scrolls are neatly stacked on the shelves. The garden outside is silent under the vast, star-filled night sky. All the deliberate actions, all the quiet routines of the day have concluded. A deep stillness settles over the home, the kind of stillness that comes after a day of focused, disciplined, yet ultimately peaceful work and quiet reflection. There is nothing left to prepare, nothing left to study for the moment, nothing left to perfect until the new day begins. Just the quiet presence of the ancient space, holding the memory of countless days lived in routine, quiet dedication, contemplation, and perhaps a few personal quirks. Your own space is quiet too now. The fan hums its soft, steady tune. The dim light is just right. There's nowhere else to be, nothing else to do, nothing left to think about. Just letting go of all thought, all anticipation, all the routines of your own day. Letting the quiet history, the gentle routines, the steady rhythm of the predictable past carry you gently, gently into rest. Sleep is here now. Just close your eyes and breathe.